Greetings everyone, my name is Rejnols, and today I want to talk a bit about how to play Warhammer 40k casually if you are a competitive player. Now maybe you've already have this figured out, but there is some difference between playing a casual game of 40k versus playing a competitive game of 40k. And even if you go into saying that you are playing a casual game, there's a various number of ways to play it. This is meant to be my perspective as a competitive player in general on how I consider, or rather what I consider, it means when I play a casual game of 40k. So first of all, what is the difference, again, in my opinion? First and foremost, competitive games are, well, competitive. You play the game to win, you will often bring a list with a lot of good stuff in it, and you'll generally avoid taking some bad units. For the Custodes, that could be bringing the Palace Grav attack, right? That unit is just not good in general and basically just takes points away from other good stuff that could be in your list. That being said, I'm not saying that a competitive list cannot have bad units in it. I'm just saying that if you had a unit that was so bad compared to something else, you just wouldn't bring it at all. I think the best example for Custodes would be there is never a reason to bring the Aquilon Terminators over the Alaris Terminators in 99 out of 100 games. Now, casual games are more about just playing the game and not so much about what you're bringing. That means that your list can be opened up to bringing, just general stuff that you like that might not be super meta right now. There can also be some rules things. Perhaps you're playing with house rules about how certain things work. Maybe you allow for more takebacks. Or you just generally interpret the rules as the game goes rather than follow the rule set to a, one-to-one. Now, when I personally play Warhammer 40k casually, I still play with the match play rules. I still play with the tactical or fixed cards. And I still play with any data slates or whatever. For me, playing casually doesn't mean that I intentionally make bad decisions, such as putting my units in a spot where they can be easily shot and the only way to get away from that point is to make, say, an 11-inch charge. That's not how I play casually. Casually for me is still playing a game of 40k, and I'm still going to try and make the best possible decisions, or at least decent decisions, when playing with my units. I also don't play with homemade rules such as, a meteor is gonna strike in the middle of the map and deal d6 mortal wounds. Those things I personally avoid. That's something you can add as well to your casual games. Let's say you're playing a crusade, right? And the theme is that the planet you're fighting on right now is experiencing a meteor rain. Those things you can totally add. That's not for me personally, but that is another way to play casual games. Next up, let's talk a little bit about terrain layouts, because when you play a casual game, you can obviously follow a layout like you do in most competitive scenes, but you can also totally make your own. I personally enjoy using pre-made layouts because it just removes decision from the game, or rather what happens before the game. These layouts are usually created by people who have balancing in the thoughts and know that if you're playing on this deployment zone, then you should have this amount of cover, and depending on what the objectives are, the terrain should be like this to allow for this and that. That's just my personal opinion. I also think it makes it easier on newer players or people who just doesn't play very often, because once again, we remove some decisions that are outside of the game itself and therefore get to the game, which is, the point of playing Warhammer is playing the game and not spending a whole lot of time setting up the terrain. There's also a ton of layouts to choose from. I usually play on WTC because that's just what we do in my local club. You can also just use GW layouts, you can use UKTC layouts. I'm sure there's plenty of different layouts out there, and if you're playing a casual game, there's nothing stopping you from setting up your own terrain layout as well. Now, if you are setting up your own terrain layout, I do recommend that you mirror it. That way there's no feels bad that one side has more terrain or the angles of the ruins are better for one side than the other one. I think it's perfectly fine to set up your own table, but I still think you should mirror it. So if you have one ruin that is, 10 inches from the side and 4 inches down, then on the opposite side, you have that as well. Player place terrain is something that I am not a big fan of at all. I do know some tournaments and a lot of players use it, but I think it is very skewed towards the more experienced players, because a more experienced player will be able to put terrain in a way that is more beneficial for them, whereas a newer player might not think too much about it and kind of just put terrain here and there. You could combine the two where you do player place terrain, but you mirror it. So if I place the first piece of terrain, I decide that it's here, but then we take the exact same terrain piece or something roughly equivalent and put on, the mirrored side of my opponent. then my opponent picks one and I put it the same spot as he did, but mirrored, so on and so forth. In general though, I don't think player place terrain is amazing because even if you try and make it fair, sometimes you just end up putting terrain in spots where it's a clear advantage for one player over the other, or because the mission layout or the deployment zone, or maybe you just end up creating like huge shooting lanes, or maybe you end up putting, 3 pieces of terrain that just allows a melee army to run from one ruin to another without ever having a chance to be shot at. Those are also things to keep in mind when you're using player placed. In general, I definitely prefer playing with a pre-made layout. Next up on talking about competitive versus casual, I think is list building. Now, list building in a casual game doesn't mean you have to bring all of your bad stuff. If you want to bring all your bad stuff, go ahead and do it. But I think the rule of thumb is 500 points of your list shouldn't be optimal, or rather it should be suboptimal. That being said, I would like to just quickly say that for some armies it can be really hard to bring bad units or suboptimal units. For example, World Eaters, which is a very new army, have a very, very small number of choices when it comes to what units they can bring, and no matter how you go about it, you're probably going to end up including some Berserkers, or some Exalted 8-bounds, or some regular 8-bounds, all of which are seen in competitive play. If you are playing an army with a limited number of data sheets, either a limited number as in you don't have a lot, or you only have a few that are good and then the rest are just absolutely horrible, I think a good way to go about it is maybe take a look at the internet and see what competitive lists are bringing, try and figure out how you can break that up to be a little less optimal. Let's just say that the meta way of playing World Eaters is 3x10 Berserkers with a leader in each that gives them, big buffs. Maybe you remove the leaders from those 10-man units. Maybe you break it down into 5-man units, so some of them have leaders and some of them don't. Maybe you bring a Land Raider, because if that's not optimal, then you can spend a few hundred points on a Land Raider instead and be like, oh, this is a little bit different than you're used to. I have some shooting, which obviously is not the World Eaters things, so that can also be a way of playing a bit more casual. I think one of the most important things that I haven't listed here on the PowerPoint when playing casual games is don't tailor your list. Now, I never tailor my list, no matter who I'm playing against, whether it's a competitive game or a casual game, unless it's something that I've talked with my opponent about. Let's say I'm going into a tournament where I know that the majority of players are going to bring Thousand Suns. And in my army, I have some kind of trick that's very good against Thousand Suns. So if I go ahead and ask for a practice game, I make it clear that my list is built and supposed to be able to deal with Thousand Suns. So I'm gonna have some stuff that you wouldn't maybe normally see, but that's because I want to practice against playing against Thousand Suns with this combo setup, whatever. In a casual game, it's the exact same. You shouldn't be taking a lot of anti-tank shots just because you know your opponent are bringing vehicles. I'm not saying you shouldn't bring any anti-tank, but meet your opponent in the middle somewhere, right? Don't be like, oh, I need to bring 20 anti-tank guns to kill your tanks. Instead, be like, I feel like you're bringing a lot of tanks, so I'm going to bring some anti-tank guns, but I'm also not going to bring so many that you cannot play with your guys. You can also try and just build a thematic list. Once again, for some armies, this is harder than others, but if you're playing Space Marines, you could, for example, just try and build a full Gravis Armor army, right? Heavy Intercessors, Aggressors, Eradicators, Interceptors, whatever else is in Gravis Armor, I forget. But if you do that, just be careful that you don't accidentally build something that might not be meta, but be too hard for your opponent to play against. For example, a full Dreadnought list in Space Marines right now could probably be a decently viable thing, maybe not top of the competitive level, but I do believe it's somewhat fair to say that a lot of armies have a hard time dealing with 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, and 3 Brutalis Dreadnoughts. So while it can be cool to be like, oh yeah, I want to play full Dreadnought, maybe, again, just look at how the state of those units are and be like, oh, the Redemptor Dreadnought is pretty good. Maybe I'll just bring one of those, and then I'll bring 2 Ballistas and 2 Brutalis. That is still a lot of Dreadnoughts, but you're at least trying to cut back a little bit on some of the better data sheets. Some examples for Custodes, what I would think of as suboptimal units would be the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. He's not bad per se, he's just not great either. The Virtus Praetors are actually good data sheets, as I talked about in my other video where I talked about fixing the Virtus Praetors, but they're just super expensive, so they're rarely ever worth taking compared to something else. But when you're playing a casual game, it's okay to spend those extra points on something, because that's kind of the point, you just kind of want to play with these guys, right? Another option could be Aquilon Terminators, because Instead of using Alaris Terminators, you could bring Aquilon Terminators, because Aquilon Terminators, again, they're not completely horrible, but they are just worse than regular Alaris Terminators in basically every single way. So here is an example I came up with for a casual Custodes list, following the rules we talked about. So what I wanted to try and do here was build a Solar Watch-ish kind of list. If you don't know, Solar Watch is kind of the fast-hitting or fast-moving Custodes sub-faction. Now, I didn't want to gimp myself by just taking a shit ton of bikes. So what I did instead was I took 2 Blade Champions, which gives advance and charge, once per game, which, is in line with what Solar Watch kind of want to do. Then I took 2 squads of Custodian Guards, 3 of them with spears and 2 of them with shields, 4 Prosecutors, 2 Virtus Praetors to join the Shield Captain on Virtus Praetor, 2x4 Witch Seekers, a Telamon Heavy Dreadnought with a fist and a gun, then 2x3 Venatari, each with 2 spears and 1 shield, and then finally a Custodes Assassin. To be honest, I just threw the Custodes Assassin in there because I had 90 points left, and I didn't really have anything built and painted where I was like, oh yeah, I could take this instead and do that. So that was just to get rid of the 90 points, but those 90 points could totally just be, 2 more units of Prosecutors and a 10-point upgrade on the Shield Captain or whatever you want. So why would I consider that to be a casual list? Well, first and foremost, we have 575 points tied up in the Captain, the Telamon, and the bikes. As I talked about in my Virtus Praetor video, the Captain on bike has really suboptimal abilities right now. Fly doesn't let you move over terrain. Therefore, his 12-inch move once per game, while still good, is not amazing. His free stratagem now only works on battle strats, and in addition, -1 damage only works on infantry. Bikes have lance, which means they cannot benefit from +1 to wound from Slayer of Nightmares. So in theory, the only free battle strat he can use is command point reroll, or +1 attack under starting strength, but there are only 3 models in the unit, so chances are, if the unit is under starting strength, they're probably dead already. The Telamon, while being slightly tough, we don't have access to Armor of Contempt, and -1 damage built in is nice, but it's not gonna do a whole lot if your opponent brings some bigger guns to point at it. He also has quite a limited number of melee attacks. It's not like he can go into melee and reliably kill a tank. His shooting at best will deal 3 to 4 wounds. So once again, not a horrible unit, but a unit where the points that I spent on bringing him could totally be spent somewhere else and be more efficient. My list also doesn't include Wardens, Alaris Terminators, or Trajan, for example. I'm also taking slightly less suboptimal war gear just because I think it's cool, right? I want to have 2 guys with shields that can tank bullets as they move up the field. I'm taking a shield guy in each of the Venatari units because I think the pistol shooting is cool, even though it's absolutely trash now. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, I am a competitive player, and while I accept I am playing a casual game, I'm not gonna make bad decisions intentionally unless I think it would be fun for the game. So I'm not gonna just put my guards in the middle of the map where everything can see them and then hope I get a 11-inch charge. Now, I'm not saying that this is a casual list for everybody. You can obviously go even more casual by saying, I really want to lean into the Solar Watch of having a lot of bikes. And you can spend, 1,000 points on bikes or 1,500 points on bikes. You could also include more Sisters of Silence, because those are in general, for Custodes, just chaff units. But maybe you think Vigilators are really cool, so you bring 3 squads of 5 Vigilators with a Knight Centura in each of them. That also takes up like 300, 400 points quite quickly. Obviously, those decisions kind of depend on your collection of Custodes. If you only have plastic models, obviously you cannot bring the Telamon. But then maybe instead of bringing, big bricks of Alaris Terminators, you bring 2-man squads of Terminators. And you just play with them differently than you normally would. Now, this is not the case for Custodes right now, but it will be in, 4 or 5 months? When we get our codex, we will have more detachments to choose from. And I am almost certain that those detachments will allow for even more casual play, because you can do some more fun combos that might not be amazing, but, make some units ever so slightly better, which makes them more viable for some casual games without being complete trash. If you look at, say, Space Marines, they have that first company detachment. Obviously, that isn't good. That's not a good detachment if you want to play Space Marines. But if you want to build a list that's like, oh, I want to play full veteran Space Marines with lots of Terminators and captains and yada yada, maybe you just pick that detachment. That is a nerf to yourself in a way that might be good enough to just make, an average competitive list into somewhat of a casual list. For Tyranids, you have the Vanguard list, for example, which is being played in competitive, but maybe you look at the units they're using in competitive and then you bring some other units, or you bring more of one type of unit and less of another type, etc., etc. And with that, I feel like I've covered what I wanted to talk about when it comes to being a competitive player and playing casual games. If casual games for you mean drinking beer and having, extra rules and all that, that's completely fine. For me, as someone who enjoys Warhammer the most when you follow the rules and you play within the rule set that is given to you, this is how I do it. If you do it differently, do let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear all about it. Thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you again, I hope you have a wonderful time.